Question 81. The risk manager of a certain public company is in the process of appraising several projects before giving recommendations to shareholders. He realizes that a few projects may put the company on a collision course with the Food and Drug Administration because of ethical issues and human safety violations. Under such circumstances, which major type of risk is the company facing? So what type of risk are we facing if we are potentially violating the FDA, which is a regulatory body? So is this going to be operational risk, credit risk, legal and regulatory risk? That sounds like what we're looking for, since this is going to involve potential violations of legal and regulatory frameworks, or strategic risk. So I think we can go with C. It sounds like that's what's being described. Let's suss out these other ones though. So D, strategic risk. This would be related more so to an investment failing or not failing. So putting aside any legal or regulatory risks, what would the risk of this project be of just kind of not working out or not returning the type of return on investment that they were hoping for? Credit risk is going to be the risk of not fulfilling obligations, which is not really relevant to this project. And then operational risk would be risk of this project not working out because failure to execute by management or something like that. So management has missteps in how they're carrying out those investments, and then that doesn't work out. That would be operational risk. So we can confidently go with C. This is legal regulatory risk, mainly because we're looking at this regulatory body and that these projects potentially violating their regulations. Answer C. Question 82. Which of the following combinations correctly matches a quantifiable risk with a non-quantifiable risk? So quantifiable risk meaning we can be measured in some way, and then non-quantifiable means it is qualitative as said, and so it's going to be more subjective, not necessarily going to be observed or measured in a number. So we've got A, quantifiable interest rate risk. That is quantifiable. An example of a measure of that is duration. And non-quantifiable risk, default risk. This is going to be incorrect. We can quantify default risk, and if we're looking at something like a bond, default risk is normally measured by the credit spread. So we can rule out A, since these are both quantifiable. B, quantifiable civil war. We can rule that out since a civil war is not going to be quantifiable. This is what we would call a black swan event, and we can know that there's maybe some risk of this happening, but there's not really any way to quantify whether this is any probability of that happening. Non-quantifiable liquidity risk. That's going to be wrong too. I think we can probably quantify liquidity risk. So we've got both of those incorrect. C, quantifiable equity price risk. That is going to be, yes, quantifiable, and this is going to be measured by something like the equity risk premium. So what is the equity risk premium over the risk-free rate? That kind of tells us what the risk is. And then non-quantifiable risk of terrorist attack. Similar to what we mentioned for civil war, this will be non-quantifiable since it's such a qualitative, subjective event, and we don't really have enough data going back to be able to kind of measure that, and there's just so many different factors that go into this that it's not really quantifiable. So we can probably go with answer C here. Let's make sure we can rule out D. Quantifiable civil war, again, we can rule that out, and then non-quantifiable settlement risk. Settlement risk will be quantifiable, so we can rule that out that's going to be wrong too. So we can rule that out on the basis of both of those and confidently go with answer C. Question 83. A Canadian company harbors an ambitious plan to launch a project in the US in 12 months. The company uses the Canadian dollar as the functional currency, and the project would most likely be executed in US dollars. However, the company's top management is worried that the CAD will weaken against the USD in the months leading up to the beginning of the project, which might in turn increase the amount the money will have to pay for the project. So we've got some currency risk here. As the company's risk manager, which of the following business strategies would work best regarding the foreign exchange risk? So we've got A, launching the project earlier than planned. This could be an option. We'll leave it in play for now. There's probably a reason that they're planning on launching in 12 months, meaning that the business isn't ready. So this may not be our best answer, but we'll leave it in play for now. B, taking a hedging position in the form of a currency futures contract. This would help take some currency risk off the table. If we locked in that futures rate, we wouldn't need to worry about our Canadian dollars depreciating against the US because we'd have that locked in. So I would lean towards B being a better answer than A so far. So I'm going to rule out A now. We'll leave B in play. C, advise the company to purchase stock index futures. That's not going to be good advice because stock index futures are potentially a risky asset. And so even though maybe we're holding futures in US dollars, we're going to be holding those in stock indexes. So if we bought S&P 500 futures, those could certainly go down, and then we might have even less money for the project in 12 months. And lastly, D, pay for some upfront costs of the project immediately. This would also suss out take out some of the risk here, since we're paying for some of the upfront costs, but for any costs that we don't pay for, we would still be taking on some of that exchange risk. So I think we can rule out D in favor of B. In this instance, A and D are also decent strategies, and maybe we would take some form of all three, but I think as one strategy, B would be the best answer. Question 84. GBL Corp has presented to its board of directors 4 advantages of hedging risk. Which of the following advantages is most likely correct? A, it reduces the likelihood of financial distress and its associated costs, helping the firm stabilize cash flows and plan more effectively. This certainly sounds like it could be our answer, and it is an advantage of hedging risk. If we're hedging out certain risks, then our cash flows, for example, currency risk, our cash flows are going to be more dependent on just the business function and the day-to-day, not necessarily currency movements. So we'll leave A in play here. Sounds like it's probably our answer. B, it allows the firm to increase expected profits by capitalizing on favorable market movements. This is not going to be an advantage of hedging. If we're hedging, we are not trying to create additional profits using those hedges. We're trying to minimize our volatility. C, it replaces the need. Sorry, one more thing on B. This would be likened to speculating. So if we were speculating in something like currency, we would be taking bets on those movements, not trying to hedge risk. C, it replaces the need for strong internal controls and good management practices. That's also going to be incorrect. We still need to have both of these things to run a good business. Hedging out financial risk doesn't necessarily take away the need for these two things. And D, it completely eliminates all types of risk the firm faces. Also incorrect. I think that one's pretty straightforward. We'll go with answer A. Question 85. Which of the following explains why the board of directors needs to maintain independence from executive teams, including the chief financial officer, chief risk officer, and the CEO? A, to ensure that management's decisions are always in line with short-term profit goals. This is going to be incorrect. And if this said long-term profit goals, then that would start to sound more accurate. But the board, the CEO and the executives will sometimes be more focused on short-term profit goals, but the board of directors' job is to keep them more long-term focused and make sure the company is creating value over that long time period. B, to provide objective oversight and hold executives accountable for their decisions and performance. Sounds like it could be our answer and is a main reason why we want them to be independent so that they can be objective and hold executives accountable. C, to take over the day-to-day operations of the company when risks arise. Day-to-day operations is going to be done by executives like the CFO, CRO, and CEO, not the board. And D, to focus on setting the company's risk appetite without needing to understand business strategy. They're going to need to do both these things. They're going to need to understand risk appetite and the business strategy. So we can rule out D for this part with saying without needing to understand the business. They certainly need to understand it. So we can confidently go with answer B here. Question 86. Kelvin White, FRM, works for a consultancy firm that specializes in pension fund management in a certain city. Recently, one of his close friends who work for the city's planning and development department approached him with an offer to work as an unpaid volunteer for the department's pension fund. In turn, the department would grant White a free parking space just outside his office. Which of the following is the most appropriate thing to do before accepting the job? So it's an unpaid volunteer position, but it is at a pension fund, which is in the same line of work that Kelvin White does. So what's the most appropriate thing to do before accepting the job? A, do nothing, as this is a volunteer job. I'm going to rule that out. That's probably not going to be our answer. At a minimum, we should probably disclose this to our employer, or we may need to get their permission depending on the employer's policy. B, request the department not to grant him any fringe benefit, including the free parking space. That could be a decent option. We'll leave that in play for now, but I'm guessing there will be a better answer. C, seek advice regarding the offer from one of his colleagues at the consultancy firm. Again, that may be something we do, but that probably isn't a better answer than B, so I'll rule out C for now. Let's see what D is. D, disclose the details of the volunteer position to his employer. I think that's going to be our best answer. Even though this is an unpaid volunteer position, it could create some conflicts of interest. And since he works for a pension fund management company, they may end up more involved with this pension fund down the line. And so it would be important for him to disclose this at this point. Answer D. Question 87. Suppose a stock index has an expected return of 5.5% and volatility of 7.5%. Suppose further that fund X with an expected return of 4.5% and volatility of 6% is benchmarked against the stock index. If the risk-free rate is 3% per annum, what is the beta of the fund? So we've got expected return of the market here, and then we have expected return of the fund, risk-free rate. So we have a lot of the CAPM components here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to plug all these into CAPM, and then we're going to solve for beta. So let's bring in that formula, see what that looks like. So we've got our CAPM, which is going to be equal to the risk-free rate plus beta times equity risk premium. And as a reminder, equity risk premium is going to be the market return minus the risk-free rate. So what that looks like is our expected return, 4.5%, is going to be equal to the risk-free rate of 3, plus, I just made X our beta variable, times 5.5 minus 3. So we're using 5.5 as our market return since that's the return of the stock index, and then 3 is our risk-free rate. So that simplifies to 1.5 equals 2.5x, and when we work that math through, we get a beta of 0.6, which is going to correspond right here with answer A. Question 88. Portfolio M has the following characteristics: expected return of 8%, volatility of 15, and beta of 0.8. If the risk-free rate is 4%, what is the Treynor measure of the portfolio? So Treynor measure is going to be using our expected return, beta, and risk-free rate. So volatility in here is just a red herring. We're not going to be using that in our calculation. So pretty straightforward formula. It's similar to Sharpe ratio, except we have beta in the denominator. So we're going to take the return of the portfolio, which is 8, minus the risk-free rate, which is 4. Divide that by the beta of 0.8. We get a Treynor ratio of 0.05, which we have right here for answer B. Question 89. An analyst wishes to estimate how the return of a certain stock reacts to changes to 3 key microeconomic factors: industrial production, interest rates, and inflation. The factor betas have been estimated as follows. So the beta is telling us how sensitive our return of certain stock is to these. So if industrial production goes up by 1, we would multiply that by this beta of 1.5 and get whatever our units are, 1 unit, it would be multiplied by this beta. And then similar for interest rate changes and inflation. Under the analyst's baseline scenario, an industrial production growth of 5% combined with an interest rate level of 4% and inflation rate of 3% would bring an expected return of 8% for the stock. So this is our baseline. Data from a reliable policy think tank predicts that next year there will be accelerated economic activity where industrial production will grow by 8%. So here these are starting to change now. So he had 5% for the baseline, and now it's expected to grow by 8%. So looking at this relative to the beta, this is going to be positive for this stock since it's going to be 3% higher, and then we'll be able to compare that, or we have positive factor exposure to that. So that'll be positive for our stock. Interest rates by 7%. So you're expecting that to be 4, but we have negative beta here, so that's going to be negative for the stock. And then inflation by 5, which is also higher than 3, so that's also going to be negative. So these are going to be positive or negative and negative for those stocks under these new expectations. According to this forecast, what's the expected return on the stock for the next year? 8%, 10%, 9.5%, or 6.5%. So essentially what we need to do here is we're going to take these factor betas and we're going to, let me pull all this in. I think I can fit it right here. Okay. Our expected return is now going to become our original expected return. So we're going to take this 8% expected return, and then we need to adjust this for the difference between our baseline and what this think tank is predicting. So here's what that's going to look like. Our expected return is going to be 8%. And then what we need to do is multiply our industrial beta, so 1.5, and then we're going to multiply that, I'm going to put some parentheses in here to help, by our industrial production shock is what the term is. So that shock is basically just going to be the difference between our baseline and the expectation, and the other prediction. So it's going to be 8% minus 5, and then we're going to multiply that by our factor beta of 1.5. So that's going to be this part right here. So 1.5 times 3%, since there's 8 minus 5 is 3. And so you get the picture, we're going to do that down the line. So then next here is going to be our interest rate shock. So that's going to be negative 0.5 beta. And then we're multiplying that again by 7% minus 4%, so 3%. So this ends up being a negative number. And then we're going to multiply that by our minus 0.75 for inflation shock. And then we have 5 minus 3, so the difference there is 2. So those get multiplied out. When we do out this math, we get 9.5 as our new expected return, which we have right here for answer C. Question 90. A certain Tier 1 bank is considering the acquisition of one of its fierce rivals in an ambitious attempt to grow its customer base and strengthen its position in the market. Before making the final decision on whether to make the acquisition, the senior management directs the chief risk officer to oversee the assessment of the risk data aggregation and reporting capabilities of the target bank and present a report within a specified time frame. The management's direction to the CRO falls in line with the principle of governance, accuracy, comprehensiveness, or adaptability. So they're directed to oversee the assessment of the risk data aggregation and reporting capabilities of the target bank. So which principle does this fall under? So for adaptability, this is not going to be risk data aggregation and reporting capabilities. This is going to be more so related to the bank being kind of dynamic and being able to provide data and requests on demand, and potentially change the framework if needed based on new regulations or dynamics in the market. So it's not necessarily on risk data aggregation and reporting capabilities. Comprehensiveness, this principle is going to be more so on the kind of report's ability to provide all of the information comprehensively. So I think we can rule out that one. And then accuracy, this principle is going to be based more so on the calculations actually being precise, whereas we're looking at the assessment of the risk data aggregation and reporting capabilities, which is going to fall under answer A, governance, which is more so the principle to kind of assessing whether at the beginning, whether we're kind of pulling in all the data properly and well, and then have the ability to do the reports and make them accurate and make them comprehensive and be adaptable. So we go with answer A.